I've been asked to talk about, we do a lot of work on modeling trees and their effects, so I'm going to talk about the roles of green infrastructure and air pollution. I'm going to mainly focus on the effects of trees, but the same type of constructs would hold for grasses and shrubs also. So there are four topics I'd like to cover this morning with you. First is we're going to talk about ecosystem services in general provided by vegetation in cities. Second, we'll go more in depth to how trees and other vegetation affects air quality within cities. Then I'm going to talk about a free tool that's developed, that's been used internationally to assess ecosystem services called iTree. And the last slide is a little bit on management guidelines. What can we do to help improve air quality in cities with trees? This is an aerial photograph of Ciudad Juarez. And what I'm trying to show here is basically in order to assess ecosystem services, the first thing we have to assess is what's called the structure. Is you need, if you want to manage a forest, you have to understand what you have. So this is just an aerial photograph looking at the city itself, or part of the city. And you can see the vegetation structure, the green infrastructure, differs across the city. So your designs and your issues related to ecosystem services are going to differ. So there's no one set answer, but we need to understand what we have in cities and where the trees are located. What we found in the United States, and this is looking at canopy cover or tree cover, which is the percent of the area looking down from the air that's occupied by tree canopies. And it differs depending on where you are. And the reason it differs mainly has to do with the availability of water. And this is important to understand, particularly when you're in desert climates. The issue of air pollution is going to be slightly different than, say, I'm from Syracuse, New York, where it's a forested region. It's going to be a little bit different in terms of constructs of management. In the United States, if a city is developed within forested regions, on average about 40% of the city is covered by canopy of trees. In cities developed in grassland areas, the average drops down to about 20%. And cities developed in desert regions, the average drops to around 10%, which is comparable to what you have in this region. Now, in the graphic here, what's interesting to note is where are the trees distributed within those percentages. And what you can see on the upper left-hand side, if you're in a forested region, about 40% of your canopy comes from residential areas and 40% from vacant lands. Because in vacant lands, there's ample water, trees regenerate. If you move to grassland areas, about 50% of your canopy cover comes from residential areas and about 20% from vacant. But when you go to desert regions, about 2 or 3/4 of your cover comes from residential areas. Because what happens when you have vacant land in deserts, it doesn't fill in with canopies. So if you're going to design for vegetation, it needs water, and often the people bring the trees and water the plants. So it's a different type of construct in terms of management when you're in deserts. But residential areas are very important, sustaining canopy cover in desert cities. Why is this important? What this graphic shows is structure. Structure is the amount of canopy that you have, the number of trees, the species, their locations. It's the things that you can physically see about the forest. That structure determines the functions or ecosystem services derived from the vegetation. And those ecosystem services provide a value to society. So when you manage a city, we're managing to optimize values on the right-hand side. But the only way we can do that is by manipulating the structure on the left-hand side. We as managers choose what species to put in, where they're located, and how we maintain them. And the designs that we create for city systems will affect the ecosystem services and the value provided by society. So the question is, if we're going to manage forests, how best do we sustain a structure, develop a structure to optimize these services for the population that lives in the city? And what are these services? We're specifically going to talk next about air quality improvement, but trees provide, and other vegetation provides multiple benefits to city dwellers. Air temperature cooling is a huge one. If you can reduce air temperatures, you reduce energy needs, you cool a city down. A lot of the problems associated with city systems come from higher air temperatures. The problem within desert cities, though, is that you don't have the moisture. If you don't have ample moisture, a lot of the temperature reduction comes from evaporative cooling. We also have social and psychological benefits, aesthetics associated with vegetation. We'll talk about air quality improvement. Water quality improvement, trees intercept rainwater and evaporate that water back from the soil, so they affect the water systems. They reduce building energy use, or can reduce building energy use. They absorb greenhouse gases. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up. They block ultraviolet radiation. terms of having higher UV radiation in city systems or in cities. That comes from thinning of the ozone layer high in the atmosphere. Well, tree leaves absorb about 96% of ultraviolet radiation. So designing canopies in cities to protect populations in terms of ultraviolet radiation exposure becomes very important. Trees provide, vegetation provides wildlife habitat, noise reduction, oxygen production. There's a whole host of services. So the concept is, if we manage city systems and we choose how to design it along with nature, how do we best design city systems for all of these benefits? Because there are going to be trade-offs and there are going to be costs associated with having that vegetation. How to design a smart city for future generations? Because trees grow through time and they die. So it's a dynamic system. That's what we're trying to understand in terms of urban forest management. It all relates to this. It has to do with the canopy. The key part, most of these environmental services are driven by having healthy leaves out in the forest itself. The leaves have stomates on the bottom, small holes that open up during the daytime that evaporate water and allow for gas exchange. So a lot of the benefits that we just talked about are related to canopy cover. So how do trees affect air quality? There are four main ways that trees affect air quality, and we use the word tree to help understand what they are. And we'll go through each of these four right now. T is the dominant one. T is temperature reduction. Cities tend to be warmer than rural environments for a couple reasons. One, because we tend to replace natural vegetative surfaces with impervious surfaces. We put down roads, buildings, sidewalks. Those artificial surfaces absorb heat and re-radiate heat back, which creates an urban heat island. So city systems can be anywhere from 2 to 5 to 10 degrees warmer than rural environments. The greatest differential tends to occur right after sunset. When the sun goes down, the rural area will cool off. The urban area tends to stay warmer because it retains the heat. And we put impervious surfaces down. We create our own heat by burning energy. And we also lose a lot of evaporative surfaces by replacing vegetation, which tends to evaporate water. So cities tend to be warmer than rural areas. Why is that important? If we have warmer temperatures, we tend to have more emissions. We use more energy, we produce more pollution. So by cooling cities down, we will tend to have less emissions given off in the first place because we'll be consuming less energy. And also in this case, in the case of ozone, which is a small component, nothing emits ozone into the atmosphere. It's a chemical reaction. If you lower air temperatures, the photochemistry rates of the reactions change, and we tend to have lower ozone when you have cooler air temperatures, along with less emissions. So temperatures are very important. Second on this is pollution removal. And this becomes very important in terms of design of urban forests. There are two ways that plants remove air pollution. We have mainly five prominent air pollutants. We have ozone, which is the prominent gas in smog, that haze you get during the summertime. You have nitrogen dioxide, you have sulfur dioxide, and you have carbon monoxide. Those are all gases. The stomates on the leaves that we were talking about before, during the daytime when the stomates open up and evaporate the water, there's more gas outside the leaves than inside the leaves, so the gas diffuses into the interior of the leaf surfaces and absorbed by the water itself. Water is a great removal of air pollutants. Do you ever notice how clean the air gets after it rains? Well, plants offer a lot of water and allow the surfaces to absorb those pollutants. And plants do a very good job at absorbing ozone, and do a moderate job at absorbing nitrogen and sulfur, and they do a fairly poor job at absorbing carbon monoxide. Ozone will damage the plant. You'll see purple stippling on sensitive species. Nitrogen and sulfur typically will actually act as a fertilizer to the plant. Unless it gets very high in the atmosphere, high concentrations, it won't damage the plant. So in essence, with gases, we have one of the active surfaces that actually actively remove pollutants from the atmosphere. The only other active surface out there that's constantly removing air pollutions are humans themselves. We breathe in gases as we walk around cities. So the concept is if we design vegetation to breathe in these gases and reduce the concentrations, we can reduce air pollution concentrations in city. The other type of pollutants are particulate matter, fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, particulate matter less than 2.5 microns. These are those fine particles that create the dust in the atmosphere. The problem with the particulate matter is when we breathe it in, the fine particle goes deep into our lung systems and become entrained into our lungs. Plants themselves will absorb or intercept particles. Again, think of it like people. We breathe in pollutants. We also capture pollutants on our clothing. So if you can design plants to capture the pollutants and get the pollutants out of the atmosphere. Now the difference between particle matters, physical mass, and gases is once the gas is taken out of the system, it's removed. Particles are not necessarily removed from the system. The best plants for removing particles tend to be very fine-leafed leaves and conifers that tend to offer year-round protection of absorbing the particles. So the particles move from the atmosphere, they stick to the plant. So if you have plant surfaces that are sticky, hairy, have textured surfaces, just like my jacket, it's more textured, it'll capture more particles. The problem with particles, though, is they don't stay on the leaves forever. Same thing with my jacket. If I shake my jacket off, a lot of the particles and dust in my jacket will go back to the atmosphere. As wind blows through the canopy, many of the particles are what's called resuspended back to the atmosphere. So the question is, with particles, where do the particles ultimately end up? What happens is when you have rainstorms and you have a lot of dust on the leaves, when the rainstorm comes, it washes a lot of the particles out and moves it to the soil system. Many of the particles are dissolved, some are not. Heavy metals are not dissolved. So what's happening with urban vegetation in terms of particles, they're fairly effective at capturing various size particles. When it rains, it moves these particles down to the soil. If they are heavy metals or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, they tend to be moved into the soil system. So basically, for particles, the plants act as transfer mechanisms of moving the particles from the air so we don't breathe it, but some of these particles end up in our soil system. Then we've got another issue. Actually, in Europe, they're finding very high levels of these chemicals in the soils around trees because the trees are fairly effective collectors of them, and they drop down to the soil. So then you get into issues of phytoremediation of how do you clean the soils out because we're having actually trees acting as a transfer mechanism. So two processes, gases being removed, particles being intercepted by the plant surfaces. We studied pollution removal by trees in the United States. Urban areas in the United States occupy about 3.1% of our land base, and we average about 35% canopy cover nationally. What that means is about 1% of our lower 48 states is actually occupied by urban tree canopies, and that's what this table is showing, is that across the United States, for all trees, we have about 35% canopy cover. The trees in the United States remove about 17 million tons of pollution removal per year, and only about 650,000 of those 17.4 million tons is actually absorbed by trees in urban areas. So it's a fairly small amount, and it's a fairly small impact on concentration changes. Trees in cities typically improve air quality less than 1% on average throughout the year. But what we did is we looked at that change in concentration on human health. And what this graphic shows is even though 96% of the pollution removal in the United States from trees is in rural lands, 68% of the value comes within urban lands because that's where the people are. So if we can reduce concentrations in cities by removing pollutants from the atmosphere, even though it's a small impact, it has a huge impact on human health. And it's valued, nationwide it's valued at about $4.6 billion, but in the urban areas alone it's about, $6.8 billion nationwide. About $4.6 billion that come within our city systems, which again is only 3% of our land base. So having trees in cities have a significant impact because they're affecting the air quality right where the people live and where they breathe. Some of the impacts are shown here. Reductions in mortality nationwide. We estimate about 850 lives nationally being saved, and reduction of 670,000 incidences of acute respiratory symptoms. And there's many others you can see: hospital admissions, school day, lost days, work lost days, emergency room visits. So tying this impact of trees to air quality to human health is quite significant and will have an impact on human health within cities. The other side of pollution removal is not related to basically air quality in the cities, but I refer to as greenhouse gases. Trees absorb carbon dioxide as they grow. Same process when they open the stomates up during the daytime to exchange the gases. They're absorbing carbon dioxide into their tissue. Carbon dioxide, in terms of greenhouse gases, is one of the easiest ones to quantify because you can directly see it in the tree. Half of the dry weight of a tree comes from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So as the tree is growing bigger, you can see the carbon being accumulated in the mass of the trees. What we find in the United States for that same area, that storage is worth about $50 billion in current storage that's in the forest itself, that 35% canopy cover in the urban areas, and annual sequestration as the trees are growing are taking out another $2 billion worth of carbon per year. The difference with carbon, though, is carbon is locked in the stock of the wood. It's not there permanently. So we have issues that if trees absorb carbon as they're growing, what happens to the carbon after the tree dies? The carbon will go back to the atmosphere through decomposition. So in essence, trees act as a temporary storehouse for carbon dioxide, but a permanent removal mechanism for other gases in the atmosphere because it's taken out of the system. Emissions. Trees emit what are called volatile organic compounds. If you smell a pine tree, Smell a rose, smell an orange. It's a natural chemical that's given off as part of photosynthesis. Some plants give off high amounts of volatile organic compounds. Some give off very little amounts. So species selection becomes very important here. What's the issue with volatile organic compounds? Gasoline also is a volatile organic compound. Volatile organic compounds, when mixed with nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere and sunlight, form together to form ozone in the smog. So VOCs from plants can be contributors to ozone formation in cities. So we have to understand that. So species selection to low VOC emitting plants can become important if you have a smog or ozone problem within the cities. The other part of emissions we have to understand is when we maintain plants, we are also emitting chemicals through our maintenance activities. We drive our trucks, we use chainsaws, whatever we're using. If we're burning fossil fuels, we're also adding back to the atmosphere in terms of emissions, in terms of vegetation management. Last one is energy conservation. Trees, when you plant them around buildings, will block winds, will shade the building, and provide evaporative cooling. Generally, when you're in warmer climates, trees are great for energy conservation because they reduce our need to run air conditioners in buildings. If we reduce our need for air conditioning or energy use, we reduce emissions from the power plants. So it's a secondary effect. As we move to more northern climates, say the northern United States, it becomes very important because we have to heat our buildings also. So if we shade our buildings in the wintertime, we can actually increase energy use during the winter season. The question is, what's the trade-off? Generally, trees to the west are the best, followed by trees to the east, trees to the south. In northern climates, you have to be careful because you want the sunlight to warm the building in the wintertime. And even trees out of leaf in the north can block about 40% of solar radiation in the wintertime. So design becomes very important. And if we then reduce energy use in cities, we reduce emissions from power plants. Nationally in the United States, that same forest, we estimate about 36 million megawatts of energy avoided, worth about $4.3 billion from electrical energy use by trees in our country, and about 228 million MBTUs of energy production, about 2.8 billion from winter energy savings. And this feeds back again into emissions. Not only are you saving money for the homeowners, you're avoiding emissions from the power plant. So this is the avoided emissions in our country, mostly from carbon dioxide emissions. About 19 million or 20 million tons of carbon dioxide avoided annually, but you can see the other reductions in particulate matter, methane, nitrogen oxides, and VOCs by reducing energy use in cities. So what does this mean if we put these all together? If we add this up for the United States, avoided energy use is about 7.2 billion, pollution removal about 4.7 billion in terms of human health, carbon sequestration annually about 2 billion, avoided emissions about 1.7 billion. So that adds up to $15.6 billion in that 1% canopy cover in urban areas nationwide. And that equates to about $1,800 or $1,900 per hectare of canopy cover or annual services just for those four that we can quantify. And on top of that, we have the $50 billion. So having that canopy providing those ecosystem services actually provide economic values to the city system. Okay, so how do we know this? If you're in Mexico, how can you possibly quantify this? We have a tool that we built in the Forest Service, it's a free public domain tool called iTree that allows people to measure vegetation either in your backyard or across cities to quantify what we call the structure, how many trees you have, and the services that are provided, some of the things we just talked about. And we're hoping to use this tool to guide management. So if you understand what you have in your city here, the question is how would you change that city system to change the services in the future? So the tool's out there, it is available online, and it can work in Mexico. We are currently in 118 countries that have used the model. We have about over 30,000 users, and we have different tools that are online. Many of the tools will work directly here in Mexico. Some will not because we have data issues. So what I mean by that is what the model does, it simulates the trees that you measure based on your weather and your pollution system. So it gets your local data. We have global weather systems. What we don't have is the Mexican air pollution data structure, which does exist. We'd have to convert that format into our format so we know it's the same data, it's just different column structures. We have to do things like that to put things in about the city and about the air pollution to make the model run anywhere in the world. So it's the same issue in Mexico as it is in Colombia or any country. It's just it's a data issue of trying to have the systems talk to each other. So the model can work here. These are the benefits that the model currently provides or is in the process of providing. The green ones, pollution, air quality improvement, water quality, greenhouse gas reduction, energy use, oxygen, and health benefits are already in the model itself. We're currently working on air temperatures, ultraviolet radiation reduction, wildlife habitat, and products that will go into the model in the next year or two. And it's a public partnership. We're looking for other universities and people to work with us on this, where we have this basic system where we can quantify all these services together to make informed decisions for managers. What's available in the tool is basically seven models. I'm not going to go through them, but ECO is the core calculator. That's the one that brings in the trees and all the local data to assess the ecosystem services. Design actually goes to Google Maps, where you can actually, and design is designed to engage school children, homeowners, and small-scale site designs, where you can go into Google Maps, type your address in, sketch your house, and put trees on your landscape. So it's how do you move trees around and design the landscape at a very small scale. View, which will be called Landscape, which we're releasing next year, is a mapping program. It takes digital cover maps at the regional scale and assesses how do you manage. So if you're looking at Ciudad Juarez and El Paso and the whole region, if you're going to develop it out, how do you look at mapping systems of where to put the trees and design the future or changes of the current structure or future structures. So View or Landscape's a map-based program, Design's a Google Maps-based program, and ECO is just the core calculator that can just take tree data into it. Canopy is a photo interpretation program. That image that I showed in the first slide of Ciudad Juarez, you can photo interpret the tree cover anywhere in the world using Google with this tool within a day and within 2% accuracy if you want to assess something. Basically, you just digitize your area, it could be the city or your backyard, and it puts down random points. You classify the point on the machine, on the computer, it keeps track of it and gives you statistical estimates. It doesn't produce a map, but it produces estimates of cover types, whether that be trees or building. It's very simple and it's a very popular tool. Species is a species selection program. It's designed to ask you what services do you want back from your forest and estimate which species will be best for your area for those services. So if it's, say, air pollution, you'll get a different answer than maybe if you're asking for carbon. So it gives you a series of drop-down lists to ask you how important these services are. The last one is hydro. Hydro simulates stream flow on an hourly basis. It's designed to look at how changes in impervious cover or tree cover in a city influence water flows and water quality at the hourly basis. So those are the 4 tools that are available. You can see the partners on the bottom there. We have many people working on this. It's a collaborative tool. So where are we headed? If you look at it this way, the field data goes into iTree Eco. If you move to the top on the online mapping tools, that's where you go to design, where you sketch a landscape. If you move to the bottom and bring in cover maps, that's where you go. I'm sorry, the top one's design. If you move to the bottom and go to maps, that's where we move to iTree Landscape, where we bring in cover maps. In between both of those tools, we have a time series model that we're releasing next year, which allows you to take your data and simulate the future, where you can grow trees and kill them off under different scenarios. It's commonly being used in our country to look at the potential impact of emerald ash borer, of killing the ash trees in the forest, and what's the impact. We're bringing in climate change projections. We're bringing in development projections. The concept behind the model is you can to manage your forest, you have to understand what you have today. You can't manage without knowing your current stock. The question from the management point of view is, what am I going to do? How am I going to influence that stock into the future? Because these trees are going to grow and die. What we're trying to do in this model is trying to optimize that to make the decision. So if I have an air quality problem, what trees should I plant, where should I plant them, and when should I plant them to sustain these services for generations 20, 30 years down the road? And by trying to bring this all together into one system, you can see that if I design maybe for an air pollution design, I might end up with a water quality issue, or vice versa. So how do we optimize all these services by changing the structure of our forest? So the tool is out there, and we're willing to work with anybody on that. We are working, like we said, in many different countries to release this or get this model to function. So lastly, management recommendations. What should you do? Well, first of all, I'd recommend that you would assess your resource. It's really hard to manage. We say this when we teach the class. It's hard to manage a grocery store if you don't know what's on your shelves. You need to have an understanding of at least what your forest is, how much you have, where it's located, and what's the species composition. Once you know that, if you want to optimize air pollution, I would focus on, if you have particulate problems, I'd focus on planting conifers because it would allow particulate collection during the winter times. You want to focus on low VOC emitting plants. There are lists out there. Most of the plants are low VOC emitting, but there are lists of ones that have higher. Avoid the ones that are high. The other thing that's very important in terms of design for air pollution is and I forgot to mention this, is that if you're going to design to protect human health for air pollution, you have to understand where the pollutant is coming from and who's the receiver being the population. So if no one lives there, it's not a major issue, but if you have a high concentration of people, how you design the landscape is very important. Even though vegetation will remove pollution, there are times when it can enhance removal, there are times it can actually reduce removal. What I mean by that is there's a study in Los Angeles that shows in the forest outside of Los Angeles, the best that we can model for pollution removal is about 15% maximum for any 1 hour. They're finding 40% reductions in the forested stands outside of Los Angeles in terms of concentrations of pollutants. The question is, why does that occur? It has to do not with pollution removal, it has to do with the canopy deflecting the pollutants from above. So if I live in the forest outside the city and have a roof over my head, which is basically the canopy of the forest, the pollutant's not making its way down into the breathing space because I put canopy above me. I'm in the interior of the forest. And that's a good thing. Now the problem within cities is we don't have forests that are separated from where the sources of the pollutants are. We drive our cars within the forest. Now you've got another problem. It's like driving your car in your garage in some cases. If I turn the ignition on and let the pollutant, there's no place for that pollution to go. So when we design roadways where the automobiles are, we want to have open space to get that pollution to disperse to the atmosphere. And sometimes in cities we have heavily canopied roadways and a lot of traffic. It's not allowing the pollution to disperse. So even though overall the forest is reducing pollution, there are local spots where concentrations can go up along roadways where people walk. So we have to be careful on the design. Other options here, we want to sustain healthy canopy cover. Large trees are better than small trees because they offer much more leaf surface area, and long-lived species tend to live longer. One of the problems in urban forestry is when a tree dies, what do we typically do? We go out and remove it. So we drive our cars there, we bring our backhoes, and we produce a lot of pollutants to remove a tree and then replant a new one. So the longer the tree lives, the less often we have to replant it, which means less pollution going into the system. Consider low maintenance, urban adapted species. You want the tree to live and you want to reduce the maintenance because, again, maintenance produces pollution. Consider projected climate change impacts. This one's important because this is what I call the wild card in the system. The forest of today that's adapted to today's conditions and the ones in the past, with climate change causing many areas, in this area probably to be warmer and drier in the future, what species will be best adapted to this region 30 to 50 years from now? And when do we start making species shifts so the trees will survive under a future climate? And that's a tough one to answer right now because we have to understand where we're headed and what species are best adapted. But again, trees can live 50 to 100 years. If I plant trees today that aren't going to live more than 20 years because the climate's going to change, that's not going to work. Or if I plant them too soon and they're not adapted to today's conditions, they're not going to live under these conditions. So we need to look at how species might be shifting in the future. We need to minimize fossil fuel use, plant trees to cool air temperatures, design about areas that are maybe high emission sources or where people live. Plant trees for energy conservation and use the products for energy. We tend to discard a lot of our wood in city systems as waste products. Why not use that wood product to heat our buildings or produce energy? Therefore, we can avoid the emissions from fossil fuel bases. And this last one here is a tough one, provide ample water. If you're in a desert system, the reason there aren't many trees in desert systems is because there's not a lot of water for the trees to grow. So we're importing water from somewhere to sustain our forest. And this is a tough trade-off. You'll get more ecosystem services if you provide the water because the trees will be evaporating and get more gas exchange, but it's at the cost of having the water. And where is that water going to come from? That is why desert cities only have 10% tree cover versus forested cities, which have ample water, have about 40% tree cover. And that's something you're going to have to wrestle with. You don't need the evaporative cooling or the gas exchange for gas. You do need the gas, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. You do need the evaporative cooling and gas exchange for gaseous pollutants, but for particulate matter, just having the plant out there, even if it's not evaporating water, will capture particles. And I'd imagine in many desert regions, particulate matter is a problem because of the dusts and the blowing pollutants from particulate matter in drier areas. So that's all I had on this. That's a general overview, and the following speakers will go more in depth into various aspects. But if anybody has any issues or questions, I'll be around later, at least through this morning. And the iTree model is available. Just Google iTree. You can check it out, and we'd be glad to work with you to make a version that might help you, say, in Ciudad Juarez or wherever you are. Thank you very much.